Our first panel focuses on the plight of workers. We can all agree that low-paid frontline workers who have risked their lives during the pandemic need a new deal. Our speakers are Chris Kempczinski, he's the CEO of McDonald's, Ginni Rometty, executive chairman of IBM, Stephen Schwarzman, chairman, co-founder, and CEO of Blackstone, and Tharman Shanmugaratnam, senior minister and coordinating minister for social policies, Republic of Singapore. Our moderator is my colleague here at Bloomberg, Jason Kelly, chief correspondent of Bloomberg Quicktake.
Carol, thank you so much. Great to see you, if only virtually. And we're honored to be able to kick this off. And I have to say, it's notable that this is where we're starting. You saw the video come in here to talk about these issues. Here at the end of 2020, we're not talking about anything to start except workers. And that's a really important note. So Tharman, I want to jump right in and start with you. This has been a critical year in many ways, and a year that may define where we go when it comes to all types of workers. What's the government's role here?
So, Jason, I think when we think about the disruption that we are seeing this year because of COVID, we've got to first recognize that it comes on top of a slow burn that's been going on for quite a while and affects not just the most vulnerable workers, the lowest paid, the lowest skilled, but actually affects quite a broad middle majority, the middle class in most advanced societies, certainly. A long period of relative stagnation of incomes, diminishing jobs in the middle, which we're all familiar with, the polarization of the job market. And for large countries, particularly outside of the metropolitan areas, just a gradual loss of hope that slip sliding away, as Paul Simon put it in the 70s. And then you have the problem much lower down, because most of the job creation in a whole range of advanced economies, I mean, some have avoided this, like Singapore and Sweden and a few other countries, but most of the job creation has been in relatively insecure service sector jobs, low skill, lower productivity, and more insecure jobs. And that's a major new problem that we didn't have 20 or 30 years ago. And coupled with that is a loss of a sense that you can actually move up in the old way. In other words, if you start off from the bottom, you actually have a chance of a middle-class life, and there was a pathway. And I think that hope and that set of aspirations is now also diminished. So we've got those two things at the same time, and they're slow burn problems. One that presents itself to the middle class, and the second, which is that those who are lower down no longer have that hope and that sense that they can actually make it, and there's a very clear pathway to make it to a middle-class life. So when we address the problems of COVID, we can do it in a way that also addresses these longer, slower burn problems. And I think that two major interventions, when you think of government, and frankly, when you think of the private sector as well, revolve firstly around that intersection of learning and work, getting a spiral back in the system. A spiral of learning, skills accumulation, job progression, career stability. And there's a whole set of issues that I'm happy to talk about later that have to come with a new way we've got to think about learning and work, that go back to educational institutions, that go to industry norms and certification, competency-based certification of skills, a whole set of issues to do with public funding. How do you actually fund lifelong learning? How do you make it convenient, time and place for blue-collar workers? How do you accumulate human capital, not just for the professionals and the ones who already have it, but human capital for the ordinary worker? How do we think in LinkedIn terms about ordinary workers, blue-collar workers? And second, we've got to think a lot harder about public goods, investment in public goods. In other words, not just the traditional solutions to inequality, which involve one form or another of redistribution. You're going to need redistribution, but that isn't going to change the game fundamentally. We need a new era of investment in public goods, everything from basic science R&D to training infrastructures, even frankly, to thinking about just investments in infrastructure, because that's going to create jobs, that's going to create opportunities. So refocusing budgets, refocusing fiscal policy on investment in public goods to broaden opportunities, to broaden job growth, and to create that sense of optimism that unites people. I think that's the second major priority.
Well, you have just basically done my job and set up the entire rest of the panel. So thank you for that, Tharman. It was interesting speaking with each of you and your teams leading up to this. Education is clearly a focal point for each of you. So I want to start there. Ginni, tell us about new collar workers. This is something you've spent a lot of time on. How do we think about them differently, and how do we educate them differently?
Well, I would like to just commend the minister as well as he set this up, because this is something we got involved in about a decade ago. And it was for the reason that you could begin to see the digital economy would not be inclusive. There would be far too many have-nots versus haves. And this would revolve around having the right skill to work in a new job and have it quick enough. And so, as you see with COVID, and then with all the issues around racism and systemic racism that have evolved, it wasn't white collar, it wasn't blue collar, and those connotations with it. It would be about a new collar job so that you could start without a 4-year degree. And there are many new jobs that live at this intersection with technology, cloud computing, cyber skills, that you could get started. And what you'd have to believe as an employer is in 3 different paradigms. And I think in some ways, Jason, this would be my definition of a new social contract. One would be I would have to hire based on skills first versus degrees only, meaning I'd hire you because you had some skills that you had built in some way. The second paradigm is I'd have to offer a new pathway. The minister used that word as well. So in other words, perhaps you've come from a 6-year high school, which is what hopefully we'll talk about. We got very involved around the world in this. And then the third paradigm would be as an employer, I offer you employability. While I may not guarantee you employment, I can offer you employability, meaning the ability to constantly build the skills that you can have a very good job. Because the issue here is going to become quality jobs, not just any type of job. So that led us down a path of what is a public-private partnership with high schools and community colleges around the world to build and say, how fast could we go to underserved communities and pull people into the middle class for the first time? And we now have a pipeline of almost 200,000 students coming through.
It's so interesting to think about that and to think about it from the perspective of a company like IBM, and then to shift immediately, as I'm about to do, to a company like McDonald's, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers around the world. And Chris, you and I were talking before we came on. We all know McDonald's. We know a Travis Scott collaboration. We know your new pastry line. I was talking to you about that from a personal perspective. But we often don't think about what a massive employer you are, and also the types of employees, which I think is really important. And I wonder what you have thought about over this past year and what this inflection point means for you, especially in terms of looking at the types of people who ultimately work at your franchises.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. It is an area we think a lot about. Just to put it in context, McDonald's is the second largest private employer in the world. Our system, we employ about 2 million people. And I think Tharman touched on it. We are in the heart of the service sector. The service industry is critical overall globally. I think about half of jobs are in the service sector. 80% of jobs in the U.S. are in the service sector. So it's an area for us that is mission critical. I think, the premise of our company was built on how do we figure out pathways for people within the system to become potentially the restaurant managers, franchisees, company employees. And so we have a number of people who have progressed through their career that way. But most people that come in through McDonald's, and I would say that they typically start under age 25, and then they go on to do something else. And we have about 500,000 former crew that are now teachers. We have about 125,000 now that are nurses. We have about 2.5 million that started their own business. And we've found that it's not one solution that we need to offer. We need to offer a range of different things, everything from English under the arches, life training, life skills. We have a significant number of crew that are unbanked. So how do we provide people with just, some of the basic sort of financial understanding and capabilities? So I think those have been things we've been working on for a while. With the pandemic, to your question, we've had to spend a lot more time, frankly, thinking about the public safety element of it, and how do we keep our crew safe through all of this. And I think that's become that's sort of an evolving area of consciousness that I think all employers are thinking about. It's not just about providing good opportunities, good wages, but there's now, I think, a much higher level of appreciation and understanding on the safety component. And we have, I think, like everybody, learned through this because we were initially not set up to think about, running our businesses from an almost a public safety standpoint. And so things like PPE and transition or transmission rates and R0 and all those things, we're now having to deal with those, which is why we've done a partnership with the Mayo Clinic because we view that as going to be something we're going to have to be dealing with and thinking about for the foreseeable future.
And so, Steve, I want to turn to you because you see the landscape from a number of different perspectives. Obviously, as the chairman of a global investment firm, as someone who is counseling world leaders all the time, from an economic and from a market perspective, one of the ways that we're seeing inequality for workers and others really manifest is in what people are increasingly calling the K-shaped recovery. We have seen the market do very well amid a very troubled world. What do we need to do to solve for that?
Well, I think, Jason, there are a number of things on the table that Tharman basically set. And there are two or three things I'd like to address. First, in terms of education, which is the key. I was in China about 2 years ago talking with a senior person there who said they were going to be delivering computer science education to 100% of their population. As we go more and more digital in the United States, we probably, in our large public systems, probably have around 5% of the people learning computer science. Not everybody in China is going to be a computer scientist, but they're going to be exposed. We have to upgrade our education system to be competitive on a global basis. On a broader basis, and some of the issues that Ginni was mentioning, I've said to you before that we need a Marshall Plan for the middle class. We need to make sure there's enough income for people, and the $15 minimum wage adjusted for different parts of the country, implemented over different time periods, perhaps, is sort of something that gives a more of a living wage and also pushes up compensation, not just for those people, but for the people above them that are probably hit 30% of the workforce. And education, for me, is the key. Education is the passport for a better life. And to do that, we need to have great teachers. We also need to look at different ways of educating, as Ginni mentioned. But in terms of teaching, we've all had great teachers, and they make a difference in our lives. And I think what we ought to do is have teachers be the only group of workers in the United States, if you will, who don't have to pay tax. And the reason I suggest that is it will mark them apart from all other types of employment as a valued class. It'll also increase their after-tax compensation significantly, so we can attract more of the best and the brightest to help us move in that direction. And we also need to help our population around the world. We need the business community deeply engaged in the school systems to provide apprenticeships and other types of ways where, as Ginni mentioned, not everybody has to have advanced degrees, but if they're linked into the business community, they'll have a place to go to work. They won't be lost. They'll be taught increasing levels of skills. And if you start putting these things together, you're going to really start to be able to make a dent in some of the pessimism that I think was described that regular people sometimes feel in the changing workforce that we're all living in.
Right. So, Ginni, let's talk about that, because I'm fascinated by this program that you have, PTech, I believe that it's called, that as I read it, essentially says from a high school, from a secondary school perspective, we're kind of doing it wrong. I mean, this is a really, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, somewhat radical approach that, if widely implemented, could really change the way we think about education, not just from a college level, but going even earlier than that. Tell us a little bit about why this could work, or why it does work.
Well, it does work, actually. And in fact, the very first school we started was in Brooklyn, and it was when Mike was mayor, actually, Mike Bloomberg. And it was just a bit of an experiment there. But now it has grown, as I said, to we're at almost 300 schools. In fact, actually, Steve will be interested. The first two are opening in China, actually. We're announcing that actually today. We're in 27 countries. But why does it work, which I think is the most interesting? Because this is the public school system. These are not charter schools. These are not something new. So it is about a governor in a state, let's take the United States, where a governor is interested in this topic and wants to support it, and where you have a principal of a school who is just innovative about new ideas. And what we bring to them are three things. We give them a curriculum, but it is not quite a vocational curriculum, because you're really just teaching people their soft skills, how to work with each other, because I can teach them, and most companies can teach them hard skills. So first, it is just about soft skills. Then the second thing you do, and Steve alluded to this, is you give them a chance at an internship and mentorship. Once people see what's possible and they see people around them, they were just born in a bad zip code. And so this gives them, and it shouldn't define their destiny, this gives them a chance. They do an internship. And then the third piece is that if you have a chance, an opportunity, you offer them a job. So that hope, along with that experience, along with the school system that says, this is an important thing, particularly Pathway to Technology was Pathway to Technology, early college, high school. It says to someone, boy, I've got a chance to change my destiny. And 90% are Black and Hispanic in the US, first generation ever to have a degree like this, and they've done outstanding. And the most interesting thing about 10 years under our belt at this is that 74% go on to get college degrees, and we've actually had our first PhD. So this doesn't mean this is where you start and end. It is about providing that exposure, the experience, the opportunity. And this to me is just so critically important that it's not just IBM, by the way. We have a coalition of 600 companies that work with us, and many are small, medium business, which is, we should talk about, a lifeblood of most countries is small, medium business. Us bigger companies can help organize this, but then we're just a feeder for all of these students into the small and medium business. Now, one last thing, Jason, is that the biggest thing an employer has to do, and this is what I've worked so hard on, it took a lot of effort, is you have to relook at your job requirements. Because in this country, we overqualify our job requirements 2 to 3x on many positions. So in other words, you have to have all these degrees when it's not necessary to get started. And to me, this is so critical in this moment if we are going to have people move into the middle class fast enough, the employers then have to go back through and look at every job posting and adjust it. Today, 40% of IBM's job requirements to enter IBM now no longer require a 4-year degree. And we've gone about this with many colleagues, are making pledges about this. Some of the governments have done it. And this allows people that pathway then to enter here.
So I want to bring in a poll that our audience has been participating in. It's about universal basic income, and should nations institute universal basic income? Sure, no. It will disincentivize work. No, governments can't afford it. Maybe, but we need evidence that it works. So maybe, as often is the case, wins the day here. Tharman, what do you make of UBI?
Well, I think first, I think it's a bad idea. This is a short answer. Now, let me explain why it's a bad idea. First, leaving aside the issues of disincentives, which is something which, we've got to go by the evidence. I'd say, it's an open issue. I'd make two more fundamental points. First, it's extremely regressive. It's extremely regressive. The idea of giving everyone a certain quantum of money is very different from giving the poor, the lower middle income group, what they need. And many of the proponents of UBI, some of whom are from Silicon Valley, incidentally, have proposed this as a way of flattening the system. And I don't think that's a good idea. I think we need to actually stack the benefits more in favor of the poor and the lower middle income group. And there are only two ways you can do it if you've got a UBI. One is that you've actually got to give everyone that much more. In other words, you don't just sort of flatten things and give it to everyone. You've actually got to raise the curve. And that means much more taxes. And much more taxes, the simple arithmetic is that it can't just be on the rich. You need much more taxes for the middle income group in order to give everyone the amount of benefits that the poor actually need. And I don't think that's a good idea for many reasons. So it's either regressive or it requires a much higher level of taxes. The only other argument for UBI is that we are entering an age, and the techno-pessimists would argue we're entering an age where the new, far more powerful forms of automation and AI are going to displace humans from a much wider range of jobs than we've seen so far. And you've got to find some ways of distributing the productivity gains from automation and AI to a population that may not be fully employed. We might get to that situation, but we have no idea whether we are getting there. We have no idea. But more importantly, whether we get there 20 years from now, 30 years from now, depends on what we do now. And the last thing we should do is to give up hope and go for redistribution strategies. What we should be doing now is investing in public goods, investing in public school systems, the way Ginni was talking about. And I'm actually someone who's quite optimistic. I've spent a good part of my working career in education. I was an education minister. I'm still very involved in education. If you look around the world, the top performing school systems are those with public school systems. And even in the countries which are not doing well, if you look at the United States, if you don't mind me talking about the US, because I've visited many American schools, including many American public schools, even if you look at the poor performing school systems, you find a great deal of variation of standards and outcomes within those systems. I have visited excellent public schools in the United States, some of whom have been turned around, some of whom are going through programs like what Ginni's talking about. Well-motivated head teachers and senior teachers, a community around them. It can be done. So there's scope for convergence across countries, and there's scope for convergence within countries. And that's a good reason for hope. The second thing Ginni was talking about was extremely important, which goes beyond the school system, which is moving away from that dichotomy that has defined labor markets for too long, that dichotomy between college-educated or traditional academically oriented students and graduates, and those who went through a technical education, what you call 4 years and 2 years in the United States. And I think it's been inefficient. It's not as if the market actually required this. It was largely a job signaling device, the market actually can do much better to recognize skills. Ginni talked about hiring based on skills rather than credentials or credentials early in life. There's been a accentuation of the traditional biases of the labor market in what's called algorithmic hiring, which has been something taking place in the last 10 years especially, making the job of HR departments easier. Algorithms that actually just reinforce those prior credentials and the biases that come with it. But I see again an opportunity in the new generation of AI tools, because the new generation of AI tools are far more sophisticated than those crude algorithms. They can actually detect, based on your prior job record, on your career history, they're able to pick out the skills you've accumulated along the way and find ways of identifying transferable skills into new jobs so that you don't lose the skills you've built up. And the reality for most blue-collar workers all over the world is they move from one job to another without accumulating skills or accumulating human capital the way that highly skilled professionals do. And we've got to use both technologies like the new AI tools, top management attitudes like what Ginni was talking about, and new social norms to think differently about blue-collar workers and ordinary white-collar workers. Think of them as human capital and find the ways in which public policy and private leadership and corporate practice sees this as an asset to accumulate over time, sees these as people whose hopes and aspirations are achieved because they are invested in and they themselves rise to the occasion.
So we've talked a lot about education, and I want to shift the conversation, if we can, briefly to wealth and a massive wealth gap that I believe we're talking about more and more rightly, especially in this country, the United States. And Steve, I want to start with you on this and then move to Chris, because Steve, these are your customers in many cases. You know, when I think about what Blackstone does, you are investing ultimately on the behalf of a lot of workers in many cases. What do we need to do? You are on the ground doing this in many ways to solve this wealth gap that is much more apparent.
Well, Jason, as I said, I think we have an income insufficiency problem, and we need to solve that with a different type of minimum wage, because we can't let our citizens be below a certain wage area. We have to make sure that educationally they can do more and be employed more. We need more flexibility in the workplace. Tharman was mentioning the use of AI. Interestingly, at Blackstone, we're using AI to help with a new algorithm, as he mentioned, to hire people, not just because of academic skills, but what does it take for people to be successful? What kind of skills do they need? What kind of people are they? And we've learned by using AI, we can find people with less conventional backgrounds. So I think we have to do everything we can to form a base. I'm involved with parochial schools in New York, where 90% of the students are minorities and 70% are at the poverty line and below. And we graduate 98% of those students, and 96% of them go to higher education. And they're the same students that are having difficulties other places. And I think there are all kinds of techniques that we can use so that people have a much better shot, that our society becomes much more able to fulfill the dreams and the expectations and obligations we all have to provide a good life for everyone.
So, Chris, on the subject of the wealth gap, it's something that has come to the fore largely very passionately on the part of one of your board members, John Rogers of Ariel Investments, and in part because of what he has seen at McDonald's in many ways, and the wealth gap that has, again, I think, come to the fore over the past year when it comes to whites and blacks in America in many ways. How do you go about solving that? How do you use McDonald's as a way? And I think you've traditionally done this. How do you accelerate that in this world?
Well, you're right. John's been a passionate advocate on this. This is he describes it as his life work, and I think one of the things that John focuses on, which is where McDonald's can come into play, is there are so many communities where there's just a dearth of economic activity. There's not employers, there's not manufacturing in that. Maybe the infrastructure, the school system isn't as strong as you'd hope it would be. And so for McDonald's, and I think also John's view and philosophy is that you've got to be able to find businesses that can go into these communities and get people beginning on this pathway. So with a McDonald's, someone comes in and works in our restaurant, they're starting to learn life skills. Now, what Ginni was talking about, they're also seeing role models. So they're meeting a franchisee who can talk about, their journey, can talk about how they've become successful. And I think, so it's the other thing Ginni talked about, which is, people's pathway shouldn't be determined by zip code. And yet, if all you know is your zip code, and your worldview is informed just by your zip code, you've got to find ways to bring institutions into those zip codes to then start to create this level of awareness, to start creating these life skills and these opportunities to other things. So I think that's for us where we view, we have an obligation as McDonald's. We are in those communities. It's kind of the premise of our company. How do we be part of that solution and giving people sort of that look as what does the world hold beyond maybe the south side of Chicago or Compton in LA or other places like that.
So, Steve, I want to bring you back in because we got an interesting question from the audience, and I'll just read it out. The global market in goods made with low-skilled labor has arguably hurt blue-collar workers in the U.S. and helped drive inequality, hence the bipartisan shift toward protectionism. Is there a realistic alternative? And I ask you that in part because of the way I set you up earlier. You talk to world leaders all the time, and I do wonder, as we move into 2021, do you think we will have a different conversation, one that is not as protectionist and encourages more global trade?
Well, I think there's no doubt there's going to be a trend to reshoring, and that'll come in industries that have critical sort of national security elements, and that could be in the medicine areas, pharmaceuticals, PPE, and all kinds of other things. I think there are regional trade arrangements. One was announced today in Asia. We have USMCA and other areas which will be encouraging more domestic content, but also continuing to have an international component. I think global trade is here to stay. It in effect is part of the fabric of society. There are certain components that work well for everyone. There are some actually that don't work so well. And I think each society now is going through some rebalancing, if you will, internally, politically, to try and figure out what works. Global growth correlates really, really well with international trade. I don't think we're going into a world of deep protectionism going forward. I see more regionalism.
And so, Ginni, as we wrap up here, I mean, I do sort of think about your perspective, sort of wrapping up where we started, which is with education. As you think about leaders out there, whether they're in the public or the private sector, having devoted so much time to this issue of education and training, what's the thing we need to do now? What is a legitimate goal for 2021 that a business leader can have to really move the ball forward here?
Well, I do believe, and I share the optimism of everyone on this panel. And just as you heard Chris talk about what McDonald's is doing, every one of us can take a very positive, proactive, public-private partnership approach to this. And I do believe it starts just as simple as if you open up your job requirements to hire for skill first. It is a pragmatic step. And in fact, as you spoke about the Black community, there's a group of us working on a coalition to bring 1 million Black employees into the middle class for the first time. This will happen because we open up our hiring and we hire for someone's aptitude to learn versus just their hard skills. So the number one thing would be a skills first approach, followed by just opening some new pathways. That is so pragmatic, Jason, but it actually is what will make a difference. This problem will not be solved in the time frames that technology is moving fast enough if we all don't join together. This is not, as the minister said, as Tharman said, this is not just about a government challenge. So for employers, skills first and new pathways. And by the way, for the government, if I may make a suggestion, and this is true in many countries around the world, it is universal broadband access, because people can't learn or do some jobs without that, as well as changing how they do higher education funding. You should not have to qualify for a 4-year program in order to get financial aid. In the United States, the Higher Education Act could be modified so that you could get credentials, not just be a full-time student. You could provide for your family, and then get funding to go back for whether it's a vocational program, a credential program, et cetera. So there are, in my mind, some very urgent things that could be done now that would have an immediate return.
Tharman, we've only got about 1.5 minutes left. We are going to be in a different world politically. We already are in many ways globally. What's your advice to world leaders who you are talking to in order to seize this moment?
Well, I think there's ample opportunity to tackle the long term and the short term at the same time, to tackle the problems of the middle class and those lower down at the same time. And that opportunity is one of investing and reinvesting in education and lifelong learning, investing in infrastructure, which is in great need of reinvestment, even in the advanced world, investing, as Ginni was just saying, in universal broadband, and I would say cheap broadband as well, including in the areas well outside of metropolitan cities. If you look at the United States, for instance, there are significant parts of the country which don't have broadband. That's true for most large countries. So investing in things that everyone can see opportunity in for themselves and their families also tends to bring people together, because they have a feeling that, look, the government's doing something for all of us. And I think it creates a more optimistic mood. It's far better than talking about UBI and sort of passive strategies. Let's talk about how we can do things to develop capabilities, develop hope and aspirations. If we lose that game in 20 or 30 years' time, we can start talking about UBI, but we haven't gotten started.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. My thanks to all of you, Tharman, Ginni, Chris, Steve. A great way to kick it off. A little bit of optimism here to start the New Economy Forum.